Well, from one big challenge to the next, how to regulate AI, to the scale-up problem, I'm joined by a really excellent panel today to discuss, the big issue in the UK is we're a great place to start things for the first time, whether you're spinning something out of university or trying to kind of start a company, but then the real difficulty comes when you're trying to scale up. That's when the finance gap hits. That's when the problems around planning and energy costs start to hit. So the theme of our panel today is really to kind of, how do we get past that? How do we support British companies to properly scale, to ensure that the UK isn't just a great startup nation, but it's also home to the companies that will shape tomorrow. And I'm really, really delighted to be joined by an excellent panel today. We have Onwurah, who's the Shadow Minister for Science, Research and Innovation from the Labour Party, Sarah Onley from the Liberal Democrats, who's the spokesperson for Treasury, Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, Tom Adeyoola, who's an entrepreneur and investor, and Leo Ringer, who's a co-founder from Forum Ventures, a VC company that focuses on investing in companies in regulated markets. But I'd sort of be remiss, given the keynote we've just had from Brad Smith, not to ask the panel what they thought. Maybe Chi, I'll go to you first.
Well, unfortunately, because I was in Parliament, I missed most of the keynote. But I think two things really struck me from what I did hear, which was, I think the, if you like, the appetite of major tech companies, and obviously that describes Microsoft, to discuss and consider and look forward to regulation is really to be welcomed. I think that is something that was missing from 12, 13 years of the internet revolution, if you like, which is multiple revolutions. And as I worked as an engineer, one of my previous jobs was with Ofcom, when we were, just as the internet was, the social media, Facebook, etc., were growing. And there was a real reluctance to regulate, a real reluctance to discuss regulate. And I think we've had 12 years of it. We've already got the online harms bill going through Parliament now, after 12 years of vast changes to the impact of technology such as social media on our lives. So I think that's to be welcomed. I think there needs to be an open discussion about it. I'm not one of the fearmongers. I think AI can bring really positive changes to all our lives and create jobs. But it does need, the impact of technology on society is something that society decides. It is not something that just happens or technology decides.
And Sarah, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, well, just to echo what Chi was saying at the end there, it's very much up to us as politicians, as representatives of people, to make sure that, the impact of these kinds of developments on individuals and organisations is kind of, I suppose, properly managed. And I think it's right that it is very encouraging the way that the tech sector are approaching the possibilities of regulation. And I think much of it comes down to, we don't yet know, although I think we can start to get a sense of quite how AI is going to be implemented in people's everyday lives. So a couple of examples that I've been discussing with people are, for example, in the criminal justice system, where we want to deploy ever shrinking, it seems, police resources. AI might have a role to play in perhaps identifying particular areas of risk. But that's something we have to be really, really careful about. We already have, for example, facial recognition software, and there's big concerns about sort of human rights implications, those civil rights implications. So for me, it's about making sure that if AI plays a role in a decision-making process that impacts an individual, that individual can always ask for that decision to be reviewed by a human being. And you could think about, for example, banks using it also to sort of think about, their loan decisions. And if AI is playing a role in that, well, if someone's turned down for a loan, can I get a human being to review my application? So I think AI can play a role in speeding up lots of different processes, but we have to make sure that there's always a human being you can refer to if you think you've been treated unfairly.
Yeah. And Tom, one of the things that Brad talked about in his speech was, and this brings us back to the kind of scale-up question, is the role that regulation plays in sort of supporting businesses, giving them something to go to, but also the kind of international layer. When you speak to companies who are investing in AI in the UK, how much is regulation playing on their minds about the potential products that they're developing?
Well, I mean, I think if you think about digital goods, right, they don't respect national borders. So with respect to how you can roll something out, how you can think about the potential risks of what you do going forward, are probably one of our biggest and most vetted AI companies here, Stability AI. They're currently going for a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit from Getty Images in terms of copyright abuse. Now, I think already last week, Japan has decided that they're not going to prosecute any copyright cases for the training of models for research or commercial uses. Right, so we're already in the beginnings of a beggar thy neighbour international regulation, lowest common denominator move, and I think UAE this week has decided to open source models which already perform better than Google's Llama model. So the notion that, I think in terms of how companies are thinking, they're thinking like, what is the regulation today? Where is it going to go? And where can I de-risk myself in terms of where would I think about deploying? Where would I think about getting my training models and so on and so forth? And the country's already trying to take a position of like, okay, we're going to be the ones where you can get it open source for free or without any regulatory risk. So the point that Brad made about international collaboration, I think, is hugely important as we think about this, and also with reference to, I think, one of those leaked reports from Google, which is like the feeling that there isn't a real moat around a lot of this technology. So large language models can be shrunk down, can be put on laptops, et cetera, et cetera. So this will be a democratized technology that will be pushed out everywhere and anywhere. And as a consequence, we do need to have a regulatory framework which levels the playing field from one country to the next.
So I kind of be aware of the kind of race to the bottom that might occur if we don't kind of get to that agreement. And Leo, I mean, AI seems like it's going to become a fast regulated space, which means you might be in business with some of the companies you work for. How are your clients feeling about the kind of discussions around AI regulation, what it means for their kind of scale up potential?
Yeah, I mean, the majority of companies we're investing in have AI as part of the offer now. It's just so prevalent. So I think this is a massive cross-cutting question for international regulation in particular. It's so nice to hear a leading tech company welcome the need for global regulation. If you think about two analogies, I'd say post-crisis, the banking regulatory system that emerged from the great financial crisis, the Basel Committee, the FSB, was a actually relatively successful way of bringing international consistency to the regulation of a really important sector. Unfortunately, it took the banking crisis to force it to happen. If you then think about taxation with the OECD, it's taken about 15 years to drag companies around the table to have a conversation about how we tax the digital economy. And so to actually start with AI from a position where some of the big tech firms are actually saying, actually, we need regulation, we need international regulation that's led by policymakers, not necessarily by tech firms, feels to me like a really optimistic starting point to actually get to a decent place in a fairly short space of time without everyone having to be sort of dragged to the table kicking and screaming. Right at the other end of the spectrum where we invest, which is in very, very early stage, pre-seed and seed stage companies, this is all a long way off. And so the main role that we play after we've invested is just helping them understand on a day-to-day basis what they need to do to ensure that the product they're building bakes in as much as they can predict of what's coming from regulators, so that when the regulation does fall, it doesn't mean that they're left out. I think often when we think about regulation, we think about the impact on big companies because they're the ones with the loudest voices. But if you're building, say, mental health diagnostics that's AI-driven, and you're a small company, you're research-intensive, your ability to absorb and to cater for a big structural sea change in regulation is really, really limited. And we have to be cautious about giving startups sufficient time and sort of a head start. And that's part of what we do, but I think we're going to need to do that across the economy.
Can I just to say that, because I think it is a really important point that it's great, and I said it's great that the big tech companies are looking forward to regulation, but they will look forward to regulation in their interests primarily. And smaller companies, such as the ones that you invest in, they do need a voice as well, and that's, I think, is a role for Tech UK and other trade associations to make sure that the interests of smaller, innovative startups are reflected in regulation, as well as the policymakers.
And to get really firmly back to the scale-up problem, now, in almost every policy paper, and even in the one that we've published today, everyone identifies the scale-up challenge is one of the issues that's confronting not just the UK tech sector, but innovative companies across the economy. Tom, I wanted to ask you, what's kind of the heart of the problem that's in the scale-up challenge that we face?
So I think, in terms of thinking about scaling and scale-up businesses and the broader sort of ecosystem, I think you need to see it in context. So all of these things are virtuous cycles of growth. Right? So, and I think if we roll back to the internet boom of the early noughties, we didn't get any companies away. So we didn't create the sort of sense of companies that had been successful, the operators going back and seeding the next set of companies to generate growth. In fact, the only two people who got their company away was Martha Lane Fox and Brent Hoban, which is generally why they are where they are in terms of the ecosystem today, but we didn't get others' way, and the US did. Right? So when I left university, end of the 90s, we had the biggest company in the world in the UK, and that was Vodafone, because we won the mobile space, and in essence, potentially, because the US was over-regulated in terms of mobile technology, so we were able to take an advance. The US didn't make that mistake on the internet side, and they were able to steal a march. They got quite a few companies out and IPO'd early, so they created that first set of successes, which basically generated that flow, and created mega-scale companies who were then able to absorb and buy the next stage companies quickly. We've started to gain a virtuous circle. The ecosystem is a lot stronger than it was when I started my company in 2008. 2008, I think the highest valuation startup was about 100 million. We now have plenty of unicorns in the space. But even with all the unicorns, there's still a massive way to go to generate global scale businesses. So when I started my company, I looked at European tech companies. 2009, SAP, the biggest European tech company at the time, was bigger than the next 10 companies in the UK, and the question was, will there ever be another SAP? Because SAP was the only real company that had gained enough scale to escape the clutches of US companies to buy them and basically take all that value accretion thereafter. Between 2009 and 2017, when I looked at it again, the market cap growth in SAP was more than all of Europe's unicorns combined. So one company had generated all the value of all the effort we'd put in to create unicorns in a almost 10-year period. So that sense of the big companies, when they hit global scale, they grow and generate value much quicker and bigger. So Brad's company, Microsoft, Google, all the FANGs, their growth is enormous once they hit scale, and they're able to buy all of the companies that show promise in the UK and take that value growth once we hit a certain scale. And we haven't therefore been able to generate that virtuous circle of escape velocity companies into global scale as much as we would have liked. So I think you have to look at the ecosystem as a full system end to end. We've done really nicely at the beginning bit for a while, but we haven't yet got enough of those role models and success stories at the top end feeding back in. We need to grow the funnel at the bottom end in terms of we need more startups, more spin-outs of universities. We need to be able to fund them well. We need more patient capital. There hasn't been a single funding round in the UK of 100 million plus led by a UK institution, for example. There is nowhere to go for a UK company that hits scale in terms of UK growth money. And if I look at one of the companies I've been involved with, LV, 100 million revenue last year, profitable. All of the growth team that built that business are no longer running that business. In the US, they keep the growth team and the founders all the way through that journey. They surround them with incredible managerial talent. They provide them structures and means to keep focused and keep excited. Generally in the UK, we run businesses for 10 to 15 years and we're pretty exhausted. We have to basically sit out.
So a question of the ecosystem, scaling funding, and a kind of culture of investment and growth seem to be kind of some of the diagnoses you've picked up. Leo, would you agree with that? Someone else in the VC space?
Yeah, I would. I think we're going to have a really interesting experiment in the UK in the next few years with the approach to digital markets regulation, because essentially one of the hypotheses there, and I thought Brad Smith did a really good job of towing the line on that question about the Activision merger, but the CMAs, the new DMU is there. One of the hypotheses is, look, the UK companies get snapped up before they get to scale, as Tom articulated. And it's never been completely clear to me whether that's really what's going on or there are other reasons. But what we are going to learn is if we make it harder for, in inverted commas, the big US tech companies to snap up the promising small UK startups, once you put that constraint in place, it will reveal whether that's actually the dynamic that we should be worried about, or whether there are other things going on. And one of my slight concerns is we'll reveal that actually there are other issues here, because there is a global capital market. But we're going to find out. And one of the things that the venture community has a concern about, and we chat to the DMU about this, they understand it, is if you go too far in that, you actually, even though there are downsides to companies that exit later on, first of all, I think it's fine for companies to exit if a founder wants to leave a business after 8 years and they've built a huge business and there's a personal reward there. We don't always need everything to become a decacorn. But the liquidity that comes back into the venture ecosystem when a company does exit, that founder then often goes on to do angel investing, the funds return to the investors, they go back round the loop. That is a powerful flywheel that we haven't actually had enough of in the UK and Europe either, as well as the companies that get to mega scale. And that's what's driven a huge explosion in the US early stage ecosystem, is that exited founders coming back in as LPs, as VCs, and round we go. And so I see it as a sort of balance. We're going to find out. It's an experiment the CMA will have to run really carefully. And I think, to be fair to the team there, they get that. And there's some really smart people there. But we're going to find out in the next 4 or 5 years whether that hypothesis is true or there are other things we need to look at in the scale space.
Well, to kind of pass it over to Chi and Sarah. So we've heard a bit of a good diagnosis from the founders and the investors about what's the situation in the UK and potentially some of the solutions when it comes to merger control and competition regulation. Now, Labour published the Startup Scale-Up Review just before a business day in December last year. And I know, Chi, you've been doing a lot of thinking about this, particularly after the budget in March. What's sort of your understanding of the landscape and some of the potential solutions that you're thinking about?
Well, thanks for that, and it's great to be here. And I'm just, I excuse myself for looking at the phone, but Sarah and I have a vote, which is supposed to be about 12:30, so just trying to make sure I don't miss that. But and I've also come back from a week in Silicon Valley, actually looking at and talking to companies from Google to downwards, if you like, and in size. And I think, what we've heard here is really true. What Labour wants to do is to, we can't. I don't actually think we can replicate Silicon Valley in the UK, but we can take what is the best practice and what is applicable to our environment. And we talk about this. I think it's really, this sort of, it's a circular economy which grows, if you like, because having success breeds success, and the continued access to capital from successful investments really creates also access to capital, but also a culture, a dynamic culture of growth. And some of the things I would say, we have, I think, issues at a number of points in that, if you like, wheel of fortune. We are creating lots of startups. The UK has got a fantastic science base, far above our sort of weight in terms of our population size. We are creating great small startups. I know that Northern Accelerator in the north of England, for example, spun out supported 30 startups. I think we've got that. We've got our regional universities doing great work. Though I think we have less access to capital than in the US, and less access to capital outside of the Golden Triangle than within the Golden Triangle. And we really need to look at addressing that. The point of Labour is looking at the British Business Bank and how some of the recommendations from our Startup and Scale-Up Review. I think the point about, I think it's absolutely right. The companies need an exit strategy. They need to, they need to be able to exit. The problem is, though, as Tom said, that the exit strategy too often, it should be more than one exit strategy, too often is acquisition. If you take away that option of acquisition in order to support sovereign capabilities and domestic growth, you need alternatives. And one of my real concerns, and we had the National Security and Investment Bill as well, which also increased the ability of the Secretary of State to call in acquisitions on the basis of national security. We need alternatives, because if you take away those options and you do not provide alternatives in terms of growth, so we need to support venture capital across our country, and we also, this point about larger rounds of funding being available. So some of the solutions that we are looking at include, and to be fair to the Conservative government, that they're looking at some of these as well. Pension reform to increase access to capital in that way, increasing incentives for startups and founders. Looking at reform of business taxation. I think just finally, we have some of the lowest 2 points. We have the lowest investment in private sector investment in the G7. That's a huge thing. Why? we have a great science base. We have the city. We have excellent capital. And I think that's partially it is about confidence. We have so much we could be confident about. but we have a lack of a long-term strategy. We have a lack of long-term vision. We have a lack of consistency in policy. And, we've had, I think, 7 science ministers in 5 years. We've had numerous. I'm not actually sure whether we have an industrial strategy or now, do we? Can anyone tell me? Because sometimes we've had an industrial strategy, but no ministers were allowed to say that. And sometimes we haven't had an industrial strategy, but ministers are all saying we've got one. I forget where we are right now. But let us just say that, we believe in an industrial strategy. We'll have an industrial strategy council on a statutory basis, and we also have set out, I won't go through the missions, but we've set out 5 missions, and this is about giving long-term confidence and also about taking the environment for growth outside of the short-term political cycle.
I'm just aware that Chi and Sarah have to leave in about 4 minutes' time. So I've got one question for Sarah, and then I've got one question that maybe Chi and Sarah can answer together. But Sarah, Chi's obviously set out her view of the kind of landscape, what Labour's thinking is. I know the Liberal Democrats have been thinking about this a lot as well, from your last manifesto before 2019, but also up to now. So what are some of the solutions you're thinking about as well?
So, for us, I was really interested with what Tom and Leo were saying about cultural and how some of that influences. But I think in terms of the policy space, I think we really need to have another look at our tax regime, because we want to make sure that we're encouraging people to think about growth, that entrepreneurs have got the right incentives, and that the wider investment community is encouraged to be looking at what we've got to offer here in the UK. I think there's lots of interesting things we can look at around pension funds. There's a suggestion that many of them have become too timid because pension regulation, discourages risk-taking, and perhaps that's something else we can look at. We really want to look again at R&D tax credits, for example, and also what incentives employers are being given to really invest in the training of their own staff, because I think that's absolutely critical. It may not be a bit tangential to what we're talking about, but maintaining and building skills within your organisation, I think, is a really critical part of the growth picture. So I think those are some of the things. Industrial strategy, absolutely. And I think, actually, you can see in France, the recent TB scheme they've had there, there's not been any public money spent, but just a real kind of focus, led from the top of the government on let's get domestic investment into our great homegrown industries, has led to a real step change. And I think, ultimately, political leadership, particularly in the post-Brexit world, what exactly is it that the government want to achieve, and how are they going to do it? We're seeing real lethargy, actually, and it's about time we had some real leadership. And I don't support the Prime Minister in much, as you probably expect, but I'm really glad that he is taking a lead on AI and that he's seizing that initiative. But we need to see that across so many other sectors as well.
The one thing I've always been surprised about this particular question is there's actually quite a lot of commonality, both in the diagnosis and in the potential solutions. That's why in our report we put forward this idea of a kind of scale-up sprint, that you kind of bring people together for 6 months across regulators, government, the financial sector and others, to kind of be like, right, well, we've done the regulation on pension charge cap before.